So good evening, I guess everybody. I'm Maura Conway. I'm Moriarty Professor of Government and International Studies in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University, and I'm the coordinator of VOX Pol. All I really want to do this evening is introduce you to our two guests, and then I'm going to hand over to them. The Master of Ceremonies is Eugenia Siapera. Many thanks, Eugenia, for being with us. Eugenia is Professor of Information and Communication Studies and Head of the School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin. Her research interests are broadly in digital and social media, political communication, and also journalism. And for our purposes this evening, she has done a wide range of research, but in particular, she has worked on racist hate speech in the Irish digital sphere and is the co-editor of the 2019 book, Gender Hate Online, together with Debbie Ging from BCU. And in the hot seat is Matti Pohjonen. Matti, who received his MA and PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, works at the intersections of digital anthropology, philosophy, and data science, so he's a little bit of a unicorn. For the past 10 years, he's developed critical comparative research approaches for understanding digital cultures around the world. And so this has included, among other things, work on international news and blogging in India, mobile technology in East Africa, and comparative research on online extremism and hate speech in Ethiopia and in Europe. And he's also spent quite a bit of time exploring new methods in so-called big data analysis and artificial intelligence for digital media research. Matti's been involved with VOX Pol since 2015, and he's here this afternoon to discuss his recent series of blog posts for us on terrorism informatics. And I think what these usefully do is describe, but they also problematize a wide range of computational approaches, methods, and tools that are in current and I guess also in increasing use in online extremism and terrorism research. So just for some very brief housekeeping, Eugenia and Matti are going to have a bit of back and forth about the blog posts and what have you. But what we invite all of you to do is to put your questions in the chat as we progress, and Eugenia will address some of those to Matti over the course of the session. So basically, that's all I've got from my end. I want to thank Eugenia and Matti for being here, and I'm going to hand over to them.
So yeah, thanks, Maura. And maybe what I will do first, I will start off by providing a bit of context and background to the blog posts, and as a way of kind of framing where we are coming in the discussion here. And I'm also looking forward to a very, very lively and great discussion, even if we tend to be staring into the abyss of Zoom oftentimes. And I do thank all the participants who are there hidden behind the screen that they managed to come in big numbers to also participate. And also thanks for Eugenia for probably being the best interlocutor that I could imagine for such a conversation. So I'm also hoping we can keep this quite organic and relatively relaxed, despite the fact that it's happening online. So, and thanks for Maura for all the work that she has been doing and inviting me. So very briefly, I don't want to take too much time from the actual discussion. So I will provide a bit of context into the blog posts and in a way where the idea originated and how I came into the discussion. And as the blog post said, and I think as Maura might have introduced in the beginning, these are in fact based on a workshop that we organized and I kind of co-organized for VOX Pol in 2018 called Terrorism Informatics, a cost-benefit analysis of using computational techniques in violent and online and political extremism research. And so in these workshops, we debated and discussed for a number of days about how do we then look at different perspectives to what is now increasingly called computational or big data or methods, or even more to the generic term artificial intelligence. And at that point, we had people who were social scientists and computer scientists around the table, and a lot of the ideas in a way originated and stemmed and kind of found form through the conversations in the workshops. So the question may become that why that never ended up becoming published, or why it ended up being blog posts. And I think one of the challenges that I faced outside having a very hectic point in my life at that point was that there's been a massive transition or kind of a change in terms of how we frame the issues. And I will try to talk about this today as the discussion proceeds. So the idea of kind of terrorism informatics in the last 3 years alone, there has been so much development, so much change that has been going on into all kinds of debates. So we don't really talk about very narrowly about the debates in terms of terrorism informatics as much as we now talk about more broadly about things like computational social science. We talk about now artificial intelligence, computational methods. So all these things have been developing and evolving very quickly. So every time I started writing the final draft or the final conversion of the published version, I found out that I had to rewrite the whole thing. So it has been a kind of iterative process of things evolving and changing very quickly. And so we thought in the end that let's start off with a number of blog posts, and we can use this as a way of bringing the discussions to the public arena, but at the same time, potentially to take this somewhere forward if there's need for it and update them. And so this is the kind of spirit or kind of background from which the 4 blog posts that some of you may have been reading on the VOX Pol page emerge out of. And so I ended up writing about double more than what I was expected to write, even within this context, and I had trouble summarizing them down. So as a kind of a caveat, we also need to take into account that there is limitations in blog posts of how much can be incorporated there. And so there is a lot of things that were omitted and missing. And again, it's something that we can probably augment and bring in the discussions here. So I think one interesting perspective or relevant perspectives before we go in the discussion is that where I come from, and as Maura mentioned, the unicorn perspective, I'm not sure about that, but I do come in the debates on digital methods or computational methods as somewhat of a different disciplinary tradition. So by no means I consider myself a computational scientist, but I'm actually an anthropologist by training. And I will talk about this throughout the kind of comments and dialogue. And I come from to these debates increasingly from what I call a kind of a theoretical bifocal perspective. And this is a reference to Derrida talking about the idea of philosophy as something that you have to operate both within, but also within the outside of the tradition, because you can't really ever step outside these traditions. So in a way, I also look at this both as a practitioner, as well as a kind of looking at the philosophical and more theoretical implications of these methods. So I have kind of learned to a relative degree of confidence of how to use some of these methods. I have been using them in my work, and I'm also currently working as a kind of a creative AI fine artist, who I do a lot of work on visuals and on my kind of side life, which I do, and I also do a lot of work on exploring the very practical implications of these things. So I hope to be able to somehow, in my own head, hopefully communicating to both Eugenia and you guys as well, that there is this kind of schizophrenic bifocal double perspective that I bring in, where I kind of try to use these methods, but I also investigate their more theoretical underpinnings while working with them, and as a way of bringing these both perspectives. And so this way, in a way more broadly, I think we can then start looking at both questions about how we use them, but also the broader social, political, and the kind of implications and issues that Eugenia, I know, is specializes in and knows probably much more than I do. So again, I will just, before handing it over to Eugenia, I think there were 2 kind of takeaways that I think, obviously there were a lot of material in the blog posts, and these things were kind of trying to address a lot of complicated debates, a lot of complicated research, a lot of diverse, heterogeneous research in a relatively summarized way. But I think there's 2 kind of points that I thought that, or takeaways that we can start also highlighting from the blog posts. And so I think one of the highlights was that once you go into looking at some of these implications of using computational methods, and that was in the first blog post, we are not always dealing only about questions of technological validity or methodological validity. And also there are issues that transcend them, that we cannot determine the use of these methods solely by looking at the technological qualities or characteristics of them alone. So one of the kind of the discussion on false positives and false negatives that I started off with was a way of saying that in this kind of systems, there is always a tension or a contradiction on how we design them, which has to ultimately involve normative and ethical constraints or issues. And this is something that I think should be highlighted, and we can discuss it a bit more. And the second point is that, which was towards the end of the blog post, another idea that I have been working with, is that a lot of the times we assume that these systems can become better incrementally, step by step, from 80% to 85%, as long as we improve the technologies and algorithms used. However, we don't often consider what is it that we are improving from. And so also to bring in this discussion of what we call the ground truth in a lot of technological methods, and try to also understand it's perhaps more social and political and broader kind of discussions, that what are we in fact talking about here, and what are the other issues that come along there, and also how that might bring in a lot of other debates around AI ethics and bias and some of the things that have become very popular and much discussed today. So in a way, there's a lot more that I could add here, but I think I will leave it over to Eugenia, and then we can take off this, which are very interesting, but also very difficult questions in a kind of an interesting dialogue form. So yeah, thanks for coming, and I'm looking forward to hearing questions from you guys as well.
Thank you very much, Matti. Thank you very much, Maura, for the introduction. God, I've forgotten how to speak. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to participate in this kind of discussion. I too come from a social science background, and this discussion will probe issues that I suppose pertain to some of the less technical questions of these methodologies, but I think that they're very valuable for us to kind of probe. And I suppose, like, we're not looking for concrete answers here. Of course, we would be happy if we could provide answers, but the point here is to open up discussions about these issues and these methods in particular, about perhaps more specifically about the prominence that they are given in recent paradigms within social sciences and beyond, and if they are really worth the kind of prominence and hype, I suppose, that surrounds them. And also in this way to put them back into their proper place within broader systems of knowledge and epistemologies. So to bring this kind of like discussion back to the actual blogs and the topics that you raised, Matti, I suppose you also alluded to this in your introduction, that methods are never only about the methods, they're also ways of knowing the world, and as such they're underpinned by values that are either overt, either apparent to people, or somehow hidden and not very accessible. So I wonder if you could perhaps explain a little bit what are the values that underpin informatics and computational methodologies, especially when it comes to extremism research.
Okay, so very excellent question, Eugenia, and also a very difficult question. So I will be kind of step by step trying to respond to this. And I think that one of the major challenges there is that it's very hard to summarize such a diverse field of research in terms of a single set of values or single set of issues, because and I will try to allude this, talk about this a bit more in the answer as I develop it. So in a way, what is interesting, just going back into the name that we have been discussing, so terrorism informatics was very popular about 10 years ago. And so gradually this term, so the workshops were still called that, but so gradually this term has been shifting, as I mentioned in the introduction, more towards looking at first digital methods, computational methods, and increasingly AI. So there's an interesting, on the one hand, a kind of shift of terminology that has been used, and also once we go into extremism research. But on the one hand, there has been a kind of a popularization of the approaches and methods that we generally have been using in extremism research. And I'll try to talk about that a bit more, because this is very much linked to where I think the idea of values, or the idea of kind of how we understand these systems in the more broader context operates. So in a way, the way I see it, one reason, as somebody might say, that I'm an odd person in the so-called extremism field. So I think extremism research and the methods that have been used in a way function as a kind of a canary in the coal mine. So they have been exploring a lot of issues that transcend the pure simple research interests for the past 5 years. And if you look at some of the research debates around ISIS, freedom of speech, getting content moderation. All of these things in a way are now becoming increasingly mainstreamed. So when I was going through this, thinking about how do we understand this idea of values, and this, you may have heard me discuss this somewhere else, but so I'm increasingly starting to see this idea of methods and the approaches we use and the values that underlie it as a kind of what I call I'll try to use a technical term, which I'll explain a bit better towards while I go step by step in the answer. So what I call is a problem solution assemblage. And by that I mean is that there are certain ways that we frame a problem, which also brings in certain sets of solutions, as well as the methodologies that enable us to address these solutions. So there's an interesting kind of double development that I'm old enough that I've been working with digital culture since probably early days of blogging, pre-Twitter, until mobile phones and all this stuff. So there's an interesting double development that we have seen happening. And this links both to the computational methods, but it also links to this transition from terrorism informatics to extremism to kind of a mainstreamization of certain methods being used. So if this is 10 years ago, maybe Arab Spring might be a good boring sounding board. So there are certain histories around this. And so we still had so what we called extremism research or digital methods partially was more focused on digital activism. And the more kind of, so people have been doing research. So a lot of it was around how do you make digital activism more effective, democratic. And so it was only when the so-called I like the term Arab winter, we started coming. So through this popularization of online jihadism and all these things that happened and debate around that, and now increasingly then with Trump and Cambridge Analytica and far-right extremism, anti-refugee hate speech, we have been seeing this kind of more change towards a dystopian form of how we understand digital cultures. And in a way, I think extremism research has been a canary in coal mine in that research. So we see these two double movements that have been going in parallel, if you look at this idea of the problem and the solution. And one of them is that we have seen this emergence of big data as partially because of availability of social media data, digital traces, and all kinds of methodology that has been emerging as a part of that. So we see all kinds of new approaches have been developed and being implemented. And for somebody like myself, there is a certain feeling of magic the first time you download 500,000 or 1 million Facebook posts and you can perform analysis on them. So there is a lot of interest and excitement around what these methods can do and their improvement over the time. But at the same time, that has been kind of conjoined or paralleled by this change towards a more dystopian discourse. So if you look at these values around how we understand digital and computational methods, I think part of it also has to do with the types of problems that we emerged out of trying to understand the more dark or negative sides of communication. And so these values that color or in a way influence the research questions and the way these methods are being used are increasingly valued by or increasingly influenced by this slightly more dystopian understanding. And so if you take a practical example, once we deal with trying to understand the problems around digital communications, oftentimes the solutions also are to a degree prescriptive. So what this means is that we are dealing with something that we are also looking for a solution to. And this also leads to a certain types of questions and answers. Not that they're necessarily bad, not that they're necessarily the wrong answers or wrong ways of approaching it, but it's not the only way that we can potentially look at the situation. So once I was going through this idea of how do we understand this, rather than going into specifics of extremism research, I think one interesting development that has been going on has been a certain kind of what you call a generalization of an extremism research mindset to other fields of digital research as well. And we see this now, it's part of the content moderation debates. So the same methods are being used, which is based on identifying, detecting certain types of content and potentially with the side effect of removing them. And so the methods work really well for that. And they also come with a certain other set of problems. So I think, I don't know, that's a kind of roundabout way for answering where you come from. I think we can then go into the more specifics of this.
Yeah, absolutely. That was fascinating. I'm very interested in this idea of the problem solution assemblage, and perhaps maybe spinning off of this, I wonder, like you made the argument that a lot of this kind of research is driven by the different sets of social problems that are are happening within a specific historical and political context. But I wonder, to what extent is this the case? Or also, I see and I think that a lot of this research is more like driven by the solutions available, if you know what I mean. So a lot of this research may be actually driven by the availability of the methods rather than using the methods to address social problems out there. So this is what my next question then would be. What is it exactly that this particular methods contribute to theory building in terms of extremism research, and also what kind of like specific research questions do they lend themselves to? So I think this is very interesting because we look at it from the point of view of, okay, we have this arsenal of new methods, but what are they there for? What kind of like research questions do they lend themselves to? Because they obviously can't do everything. And also with respect to this particular question, to what extent can they contribute to actual theory building instead of just describing what is out there? I think this is the perennial problem of what was called earlier big data kind of research. And also, as an aside, you mentioned that you downloaded 500,000 Facebook posts. Are you still able to do this?
So we go with the easy. We start off with the easy question. Pre-2015, yes. So that was before Cambridge Analytica. So obviously these are very difficult questions and in terms of theory building and methods, but I think one of the points that I was also trying to stress that there is partially, as we know, it's both linked to the availability of certain types of data that we work with. So I'll take an example of a comment, and this is, we were working on online hate speech in Ethiopia when the country had about 5% internet penetration rates. And so we went to Oxford, this very kind of formal Oxford African Studies discussion to present our results. And obviously we couldn't get the projector to work, and we showed our laptop fancy graphs and kind of data stuff to an audience that wasn't as familiar with that kind of work. So one of the questions that was asked was that why do you look at the social media for this purpose? Why don't you look at something else? Because we are in a country where it's very urban middle class, and it's a very small problem set that you're dealing with. So my response in a way was that, yeah, if I had sufficient funding, I would rather get, let's say, 100 anthropologists and send them to all different parts of the place and have them work for 18 months, trying to figure out the very nuanced, granular details of what is going on. But we don't have that kind of funding, and nobody will give that kind of funding for doing very thorough classical research. So as a second best option, we can then start looking at public online conversations. And so in a way, once we start going into a lot of these methods, because they're available, so there is this new possibility that has been provided by this explosion of digital traces online, where certain types of questions and answers can be approached, and they are potentially new questions that could not have been approached in the classical sense. So I think a lot of it has to do with that there are serious new questions that can be answered and new certain interpretive frameworks that can be derived from them. But at the same time, as you say, whether the research is being then driven by the discovery and excitement, it's something that I think the blog post, in a way, what I'm trying to do is that these are, if you start demystifying of what is involved in different types of so-called computational methods, they are very valuable for certain purposes, but for certain other things, they might not be as useful, and they don't replace the older theoretical frameworks and the kind of hype that or excitement that existed when big data became a keyword, such as that we don't need theory anymore. This is the Wire proclamation that theory is dead. We have only models and we can just use big data. In fact, the last 5 years have proven the contrary, that what we need is more theoretical and critical models. And we need more theoretical and critical discussion, so that these methods are not being used purely because they are there, but rather as significant parts of theory building. So some of the more practical kind of suggestions that I did give for, let's say, social network analysis in the blog posts was that we probably don't know much about what goes behind these metrics unless we go into then the theoretical frameworks, or we place them into some kind of more qualitative or contextual framework. And so, yes, I fully agree. I think we should not be driven by the excitement of the methods unless we are working on some kind of exciting creative AI artwork, which is slightly different. But at the same time, we have to bring in this kind of negotiation between the theoretical frameworks and the limitations, and as well as what is available and possible with certain types of methods. And that's the kind of work that I've been also trying to highlight and foreground. And again, it comes down to the way we frame the problem, or the way we frame it theoretically, also partially enables and restricts the types of methods and solutions or findings that we can get from that. And so yeah, I think you're completely correct.
So I suppose maybe this, in some respect, this is also part of the more broader issue of research into extremism, that it's not necessarily driven by theoretical considerations, but by very kind of like real practical aspects, especially if you consider that people may be harmed. So I suppose this may be also a factor here. But I wonder then, even if we assume that that these methods are linked to theoretical frameworks, that they are kind of like driven by specific research questions about, you know, reality out there, to what extent are they fit for purpose? In other words, do they actually are they actually capable of addressing these research questions and then providing answers that we can rely upon?
So again, I think there is such a diversity of different types of methods, and so I think one of the challenges, again, I'm trying to kind of structure this in my head. So when we are dealing with computational methods, I think we can start differentiating already at this point. We can talk about this a bit more later, between what is called analysis, what is called detection, and what is called prediction. And each of them come up with certain clusters of using methods and certain assumptions in them. So an analysis, potentially, if you use computational methods, you're not making broader claims about certain types of social processes. So you are analyzing for data, what is there, what are the patterns with it, what are the kind of, you do social network analysis, you look at analyze how the communities are, what are the kind of boundaries with them, there's certain statistics, and these are relatively not as kind of difficult to conceptually look at. So a lot of analysis is relatively sophisticated in terms of the data available, and we can talk about data a bit more later. But then once you move on from analysis, and I think increasingly we're seeing a move towards what is called detection and prediction. And these terms are, so detection involves looking at large data sets and trying to find an example of, let's say, X and Y. So if we're trying to find an example of, let's say, ISIS supporters, and we're trying to detect who they are by weaving through big data sets. Or we are trying to find examples of far-right supporters, or we're trying to find examples of hate speech. And so we're going then into this idea that we are trying to identify certain things. And even more, we're trying to start classifying certain social processes based on the detection that we find. And so at that point, once we start going into what do we do with the detections, so what I talked about in the blog post is that we are going into, again, relatively complicated theoretical terrain, because every detection, as we know, systems are not foolproof. So every detection with itself, it brings in the possibility of getting things wrong. So we have to start thinking about what is the balance that we want to do in terms of getting things wrong and right. So I use this example of, which is very common in medical research, which looks at false positives and false negatives. That in fact, when we are looking at getting things wrong, we are getting things wrong in two significantly different types of ways. And each of them might have broader social and political costs that we need to also bring in the frameworks. So let's take an example. We want to identify a neo-Nazi supporter who's doing something, who's about to commit a violent act. So if we don't identify that person, which is called false negative, if I get the terminology wrong, we're also having the certain social cost of that person not catching that person so they don't commit something. Whereas, let's say another case where we falsely identify certain people as belonging to a category. So let's say we are looking at ISIS supporters, but then we start profiling a broader community of people who might not be explicit supporters of them. We are then also creating suspect communities. And so in these both cases, we are dealing with a certain kind of trade-off between, I think one of the participants of the workshop said it really well, that this is something that we cannot solve by the technological considerations, but that this trade-off works according to ideas of privacy and all kinds of other issues that we want to bring in there. So in a way, I think answering to your question a roundabout way, there are again, I don't want to go into the diversity of different motivations of why people going into extremism research, but there is the risk that we need to also look at what is in fact involved in this kind of performative act of dealing with communities as extremists or something else, and what comes out of that. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question in a roundabout way.
Yeah, or probably created more questions, because I suppose like it's one thing to come up with a false positive or a false negative, but I wonder in general in social science methodologies we have that like these kinds of concepts that I suppose are helpful in helping us understand the value of the methods and the value of the research. And I'm talking now about the concept or the construct, if you want, of validity, to what extent the methods are doing what they're saying they're doing. So it's not only that they may not be as accurate, but in general, are they actually doing what they're saying they're doing? So it's this kind of validity that I suppose in more qualitative research, for example, in content analysis, you get people to agree, or you use other kinds of proxies, give it to people who would know, and then you check the validity. But what kinds of, I suppose, procedures are followed to ensure or to approach any kind of validity of these methods?
Yeah, so again, I think there is the challenge of generalizing that there is one form of validity that would be used. So I think we then, once we go into the idea of different debates on validity, for instance, intercoder reliability, or I think it's called phase validity, all of these bringing different elements into the situation. So I think we can pick up the idea of ground truth slightly later. But what I'm interested in here, and we can then start generalizing this, if we look at the idea that the whole idea of extremism in a way that we are trying to identify certain debates with a certain purpose. So what in fact are we trying to do when we are trying to identify certain things? So we're trying to come up with a classification. Something belongs to a category and something doesn't belong to a category. And so oftentimes the way this becomes validated, that we need to have a certain, I'll have to bring in the ground truth to explain this in proper order. So the way that we are validating that something belongs to a category, we need to have this idea of ground truth based on which we determine what is the category. And that determines, so in terms of, let's say, what are the characteristics that we decide belong to the idea of that somebody belongs to a certain group or an extremist group, or if we identify what are the characteristics of hate speech. And it is this ground truth oftentimes according to which we validate that. And the ground truth in a way is the standard according to which we in computational methods usually validate the results using different things. And we can go in later into supervised learning and other things. So the idea of ground truth in a way is not that significantly different from qualitative methods. So if you look at intercoder reliability, oftentimes this ground truth, obviously in the historical sense, there hasn't been enough effort put into validating ground truth, but now there's a system now that with all the criticisms, there's a lot more intercoder reliability going on. So in the intercoder reliability, you get a number of people to agree and on what is the accepted definition of a certain, and then we use that as a way of classifying debates in content analysis. So oftentimes this is supposed to be a process where you get different types of people to agree on certain things. Oftentimes it is basically dictated by the research project. So as you know, as a researcher, when you have a code book, you have sometimes about 20 to 30 pages of instructions of how this ground truth or this intercoder reliability is supposed to work. And once you iterate, people finally will agree on a definition. And so a lot of the other ways of doing this validity in a way are not that different from earlier methods. So what is interesting then is that if you look at this idea of what is it in being validated, this the problem is not as much about what happens after we have come up with the intercoder reliability or what has happened after we find out the ground truth. It's more challenging to determine what this ground truth is in the first instance. And that's the kind of thing that I wanted to bring in the blog post as well, that we can always come up with minor tweaks to a method that will improve the accuracy of how we measure the system based on the ground truth. But that doesn't say much about how we come up with the ground truth in the first place. And so there's a lot more debate that needs to be had on what it is. So I think in a way, in a broader sense, if you look at research on extremism and the more dark sides of digital communication, there is this idea of what is in fact we are measuring this towards. And it works relatively well within certain problems. Sometimes there are serious challenges with that. And one of the reasons I bring this into my kind of understanding as a more anthropological background or the research that I have done is that when we were again working on, and this is the kind of some of the motivation where I come into the situation. So when I was doing work in Ethiopia on online hate speech debates, we were actually hosting workshops where we're trying to debate how do we understand the notion of this idea of how do we understand who is responsible, what in fact is it, what is the harms, and how do we prevent it of hate speech in the country online, and using there's a stakeholder meeting with the opposition and the government representatives, the church, the media. And so for a long time, there was a lot of very heated debates, and it was very difficult to get people to agree on what that definition was. And so they took a lot of, so there was one comment that one of the old professors who has now died, I'm trying to find it here, which I remember that the comment that he made, and after summarizing, as this, when you're a more senior professor, you summarize these discussions in your kind of elegant way. So what he said, he said, I'll quote here because I have it written down here, is that these are the horns on the head. This is hate speech, fear. It is very obvious that when we are looking, what we are looking for here is war for the mind, dirty or clean. There is war. There's war for the mind going pro and going on pro and against government. What should we do? If the opposition succeeds in putting on big horns, people will be afraid, and vice versa with the government. Can we remove the horns? We are looking at conflict. In conflict, we have two sides. In conflict, we must make both sides good. Two good groups talk together. If one is entered as bad or good, there's no way forward. So basically, what I took away from that very long research process is that once we start coming up with certain definitions, it's very hard to agree on a kind of a way these definitions work. So they are in fact part of a broader social and political conflict itself in places like Ethiopia. And so if we bring that back into the way we are measuring things, what he was saying is that we shouldn't look at what it is, but how it represents some kind of underlying dynamic. So I've been reflecting on this a fair bit in some of the work that I've been doing. And so in one of the other pieces that I wrote, I started looking at this, the way we frame the metaphors between. So we're often seeing, on the one hand, this kind of more extremism, or it's often more common in the West. And so where we have this center around which we have the head, kind of center core around which we have allowed speech or allowed activity, and then we have situation around it which is forbidden or should be restricted. Whereas in conflict, you have two sides, and one of them is, and they are opposing each other, and in between you have spoilers, people who want to make the conflict worse, and there are people who want to make the conflict better. So by this kind of example of having done work in a different context, we already see two very different constitutive metaphors of how we frame the issue or frame the idea of ground truth. But one is that we have a very solid set of definitions that we can apply for certain situations, or alternatively, we have that the situation itself is very difficult to come up with a consensus, that we need to look at the tensions underlying it. So not that saying that this should be something that applies to all the different contexts, but it's again a way of problematizing that. Why in, let's say, we look at extremism research, these are one way of framing the problem and what might be involved in that. So again, I went very roundabout way, so I don't know if that answered the difficult question.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to make it a little bit more concrete, for example, what I had in mind more specifically is that in situations like this in real life, in social life that we're observing, it's not, I mean, the example of Ethiopia is perhaps instructive, but I'm thinking of, that we cannot, it's perhaps problematic to think of all the voices as having like equal validity, because quite clearly the voices of people who tend to be harmed by extremism or extreme speech have to count more than the voice of those who are doing the harm. So I suppose the ask here is to find some kind of like ground truth consensus that at the same time centers the voices of the people who tend to kind of like be on the receiving end of potential harms, and not only of like the outcomes of extreme speech or extremism, but also by the methods themselves. So I suppose if you are to design maybe an artificial intelligence system that looks to detect, or okay, we'll come to the prediction later, but even in the sense of detecting, what exactly is it detecting, and whose job is it doing, and what kind of like master is it serving? That is the question that I was trying to get at. Both earlier when it comes to values and now when it comes to ground truth, that is perhaps more kind of like an epistemological question. But yeah.
Maybe Eugenia, very briefly on the first question, and I don't want to, because we're dealing with a lot of both researchers that are doing seriously good work, lumped under the same category of the kind of blurry line going into obviously extremism research is often done also by certain companies in content moderation, but it's also done by the police security services. So the reason I've been a bit kind of saying that obviously you cannot lump all these people in the same category in terms of the motivations. However, as you're alluding to, a lot of these methods, the way they are being employed, and a lot of critical research has gone into this, also serve the interests of certain political systems. So if you look at like predictive policing, or if you look at border control, or the war on terror, and there's been books written on this, obviously they have been predominantly, at least in the earlier stages, employed or powerfully employed by a lot of state actors. But at the same time, I think where I started off with is that I think now the use of this method is now also becoming mainstreamed. So we are seeing their use a lot in like anti-racist hate speech research and other things. So it's very difficult to lump different people under the same category. So there might be motivations in people who are doing, for instance, anti-racism hate speech, or working against far-right extremism, who have different motivations than, even though the system or the mechanisms that they're using are in a technological sense are the same. So I don't know if that makes kind of sense.
Yeah, it does. Though I'm pretty sure that there has to be a way of agreeing certain ethical parameters within which this kind of research applies. But let me just stop here very briefly and encourage our listeners to submit questions via chat or by the Q&A function. So please feel free to kind of like put your questions there, and then we'll go through them as the discussion proceeds. So the next kind of like area that I wanted to probe a little bit further with you, Matti, concerns the problem that I suppose it's the most readily identified by both computer scientists that develop some of these methods and social scientists as well, which is the problem of like the training data sets for machine learning kind of approaches. So you spoke in your blogs about like supervised methods and supervised methods, and also about the more technical side of things. But if I understand correctly, a lot of these hinge basically on the kinds of like data sets that you use in order to train these systems. So, and we know, as you mentioned earlier, that a lot of these data sets are generated on the basis of convenience. These are data that we have available, for example, from Reddit or wherever you can kind of like harvest them. So I wonder if this kind of like the use of training data sets adds an added layer of complexity and bias into these models and also the systems, and also to what extent is it really fixable? Because we hear a lot about bias in algorithmic systems being fixable because it's a question of data, but I wonder if this is really the case.
So yeah, again a number of very relevant and I think also very challenging and difficult questions. So yes, the third blog post, or the last blog post, if you have the introduction, talked about predictive modeling and looked at some of the models. So the common story here that we have heard a million times is that garbage in, garbage out. So the models are as good as the data that is being put into them. And so what was interesting around the evolving of these computational models, that we have now had this very increasingly relevant and increasingly powerful debate on AI ethics and AI bias, that a lot of the data sets that a lot of them, especially the most sophisticated systems, are trained on, in fact, in a way bring in certain latent biases from where they are derived from. I mean, there are multiple issues from a global perspective. There are parts of the world we don't even have data, so this issue doesn't even exist because there's nothing. So the bias is globally structural, but in the domains that we have been using them, so these language models might have certain, and this is often a legacy of the way data sets exist in the real world. So it is, in a way, cultural biases seep into the data sets that are being used. So there is, in a way, two ways. And then by proxy, this becomes relevant to the models we are using in research, is because we might then reproduce these biases within our results and ad infinitum. So it's like sedimentation of different levels. So there's two ways of potentially approaching this. I think we can kind of start thinking about. And there's the whole de-bias AI debate, which I think is extremely relevant. And so it's a way of identifying problems within these data sets as a way of curating them better so that the results won't be as unrepresentative of certain populations, including race, gender, ethnicity, and so forth. And then there's a second option that I have been thinking about a lot, which deals with the fact that, in fact, AI is also a window into already existing cultural biases. And so one of the debates that I have been interested in here is that how, or can we then create an unbiased data set? And that's the question you're asking. Is it possible, or are we barking at the wrong tree here? When in fact, should we include people who are vulnerable, people who are indicating the research in the process of developing these data sets, because the results in a way affect them? And so I think this is what you have been talking about in some of the other work. So there is as a kind of a old culture studies person who read a lot of culture studies, there's a good quote by Roland Barthes from the 60s, one of these cranky old Marxist critical theorists. So he said that objectivity is the unauthored voice of the bourgeoisie. So by that he meant that what is not being said there is basically where the power lies. So even in data sets like that, the question then becomes, should we aim for this univocal, unproblematic, unbiased ground truth that we build the models on, if we just improve them and make it better? Or should we then foreground the fact that this construction of AI models itself within extremism research for certain problem areas within hate speech research should also be a part of a kind of a research problem that we're working with, that should include also the social, ethical, and political issues into it? So for instance, there are examples of participatory dataset building where, because we are dealing in a way, as I mentioned the Ethiopian case earlier, we are dealing with potentially social, especially in sensitive fields that we are researching. We are dealing with social antagonisms, political antagonisms, all kinds of issues that are also implicated in the data sets. So in a way, it becomes a choice of how we curate them. So I think these are the two ways. So once we start approaching from this sense, I think the question about unbiasing data sets could also be turned around, or de-biasing data sets, that we are very careful of the types of data sets we want to curate for a certain purpose, and hence the models will also work towards the purpose we're trying to aim, rather than using them passively and kind of unconsciously. Obviously, when you look at dogs and cats, it's not really a big issue, but when you're dealing with profiling communities, or we are trying to identify certain malignant actors, it becomes a lot more sensitive. So that's the kind of debate that I don't have any clear answers, but I think that's some of the debates in a very subtle sense in the post that I was trying to raise as well.
This is very interesting for me because in part my background is in journalism studies, and this has been a perennial kind of like discussion within this sphere. Can you have objective journalism? It's impossible, but then at the same time you have to have journalism that at the very least is accurate. So I suppose some of these debates and if not solutions, then the norms that have emerged within journalism or communication studies could possibly feed into this debate about training data sets. Also, I suppose something that is made clear by Bart and others is that you have to make your ideological stance very clear. So if you're saying, okay, well, I want a system that is explicitly feminist. And this is why I suppose I wanted to start this question with the issue of value. And then perhaps now we return back to the issue of values. So then that, if you make it clear, then a lot of other pieces fall into place. So you cannot be God. You cannot assume the place of God and then say, okay, now we'll recognize who's extremist and who's not extremist and who's the bad guy and how to take them out. But then you kind of like see where all the pieces kind of like fall together. And I suppose this brings me to the last kind of like set of questions that I have for you that concern the outcomes of this research, because in part, of course, our research on extremism is oriented towards theory building, as we mentioned earlier, but a very real part of this is that this is actually research that feeds into social policy. So if we take into account all these issues that we discussed, but also the requirement by governments, by other kinds of actors to produce the empirical basis for policy, how can we kind of like deal with this conundrum? How can we say to them, what can we say to them? How accurate is this research? Especially when there is pressure to say, okay, AI can predict, tell us now then, what do you predict? It's like a new kind of like oracle, I suppose, in a way.
There was a term called solutionism at some point, which was a very good. I think one thing is that also is good to be oftentimes, yes, there is some feedback in the policy, but oftentimes academic research functions slightly separate from policy, and sometimes it doesn't have the power to influence policy. If you're lucky, it does have power to influence policy. So I think one of the things that where it becomes increasingly relevant is then to use research to identify some of these issues and to bring in, even though that might be the nagging critical person in the back of the room, that, by the way, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Rather than providing, okay, here's an easy response, this is what is happening online. You also use that opportunity to problematize some of the ways that you're dealing with it. So obviously, I think the big elephant in the room, or the big question here, is that a lot of the data that is currently being used is not something that we researchers have access to. So the biggest data sets exist with social media companies, they exist with governments, and they're using them regardless of what we're doing. And one reason why I think it is relevant for social scientists and people working in extremism field to be actively involved in that is that the situation is too important to leave either to computer scientists or to leave these companies alone. So we can bring in then, okay, some of these additional questions into what has been going on, which might not be always as solution oriented. And so what I'm doing in my research is we're working on content moderation. So I'm interested in partially looking at how AI systems are then being used in content moderation vis-a-vis different kind of countries that have not been usually covered. And so trying to raise questions about what does it tell more broadly about certain social and digital, social and political processes. And in a way, obviously, at the same time, I don't dismiss, even though if I've been very critical of the research being done, I think criticism is often the best form of flattery. So by involving in this kind of dialogue that we're doing, we can then also make sure that the methods we use, or people use in more classical extremism research as well, you cover the grounds, you make sure that in such important issues, you are very confident of the results that then you present, because they might have policy impact. So I think that's the most we probably can do as academic researchers.
I wonder though, Matti, if we couldn't, and I know there are important discussions taking place elsewhere, is there kind of like, could we participate in formulating a set of norms and ethics, and then kind of like perhaps guide research into this? I know that all of us now in our universities, we have like ethics guidelines, and every piece of research has to conform with these ethical guidelines. But I wonder if we could specifically prepare a set of codes or a set of norms that will function as a set of parameters that guide this kind of research, and that there has to be certain kind of like, there have to be certain limits. For example, when I was reading your blog on prediction, and knowing also what is going on in certain, I suppose like in the US with predictive policing, and in the UK with risk assessment in terms of welfare fraud and welfare entitlement, I'm very, very concerned. I'm very concerned as a citizen, as well as an academic, that in part our research could kind of like be used in this way. So I suppose like what I'm asking is, could we say no to a particular kind of research, even if there is a possibility to develop like the know-how, to the methodological know-how?
So there's two different things here, and one is definitely, I mean, there can be certain types of ethical guidelines. Whether people will follow them, that is obviously a different question, because you can there are, I think, such guidelines already exist for ethical computing, and they are coming up with new ones. So yes, that can be happening, and also more specific link to extremism research, it might make sense to do some checks and balances and guidelines. And I think there's a lot of good work already being done on that. But I think more broadly, what in fact we are dealing with is a certain kind of, the way I see it is that we are now in kindergarten and we are training systems, and they are increasingly becoming better of doing certain things. So like in school, we should have a social and political discussion of how we want to raise our children. So we need to have certain kind of literacy programs of what are the, because obviously the values are not going to be absolutely something that everybody can agree on. But as with school, we are telling them we should teach them certain understanding of the world. So in a way, something like that as a form of a training guidelines for how we want to train these cumulative systems and what are the issues involved. I think that definitely is an important task. And also another thing which we probably don't have enough time to talk about is data sets. I think data sets also potentially, because every data set to a degree is kind of manufactured or synthetic, or we should also potentially start seeing data sets as a public good, which is also like libraries are being curated by a certain public understanding, so that we want to use these data sets. We can then now they're being open source and there's work being done on that, but we should also be, okay, how do we know that this data set is useful for this purpose? And it's sure that it doesn't have these biases in it. And it should be also a lot more kind of public investment should be going into creating these puzzles and tools that we can use, or this fundamental piece of the tools that we can use. So I see it this way. I think both are very useful, and I think this kind of work needs to be done. And I think I think there's also good work being done at the moment.
I'm very happy that the conclusion is that we're at early stages yet, and we still have a lot to learn. So I suppose like our time is running out, and we still haven't heard from anyone from the audience. Oh, there is a question.
We can go into more specifics. I know we have been approaching a lot of abstract issues here, but
yeah,
very happy we can take all more specific questions, because I think a lot of the issues we're dealing with the broader, given the time as well, and we open the chat as well.
Yes, there is a question here in the chat that I'm going to read aloud. And I'm sure you have access to it, Matti, as well. So this is by Julian Horner. In radicalization extremism research, we oftentimes don't have access to large data regarding individual digital trace data. Hence, observing radicalization paths of individuals is nearly impossible. Could you elaborate on this issue a bit? What are possible workarounds? I think one possible solution could be measuring radicalization potential of digital spaces, i.e. certain Telegram channels. That's interesting. And to, sorry, that was my, and to conclude about its danger for people, it's danger for people to radicalize themselves, get radicalized. Yeah, it's a kind of like very interesting question, because then you have to follow a lot of steps to get at what is danger, what is radicalization. But I'll let you address this, Matti.
The first has to do with, so in 2017, there were a lot of really depressed researchers. And this was because Facebook and other platforms started shutting down the access of data. And while simultaneously, because of the crackdowns, a lot of activity went on channels like Telegram. So a lot of the methods that have been developed that were very good in large data sets became more difficult to work with, especially in platforms like Telegram. So now the question there becomes that if you are incapable of, so I think my limit is, this is addressing Julian, my limit is about 1,000 Excel lines, that if it goes above 1,000 Excel lines, you might be better off using some computational method. But if it's under that, why should we do, why some of the computational or big data methods are probably not the best to be used. So why don't we just use old school participant observation or other methods that are more suitable for closed platforms? So in that sense, if you want to look at, for instance, debates on radicalization, you can follow this rather than trying to come up with certain measurements for what is radicalization or not, but doing more qualitative research on that. So again, yeah, so that would be my kind of roundabout answer. That I don't know if the best solution that would be having some kind of statistical criteria for radicalization when you can do qualitatively.
Yeah, I wonder also if you could do, maybe this is what Julian means more specifically, if you could identify certain discourses that have been associated with radicalization in the past, and then you encounter them in specific Telegram channels, that might be an indicator of what is the potential, and I suppose that you can rank this in terms of incidents and so forth. So I suppose there are workarounds. The question, I suppose, is like, what do you do with this? And also because radicalization discourses tend to be quite dynamic. So even if you trace something, by the time you operationalize it, it may have shifted to something else. So you're always playing a catch-up game, I suppose.
But so to be slightly more positive, now that Twitter has opened up their API for academic researchers, so now we have some hope in the horizon, because it was gloom and doom for the time being because everything was being shut down. But at the same time, we also, one of the things that I mentioned in the blog posts, and we could also highlight here, is that the availability, and I think Eugenia, you mentioned this in the earlier question, the availability of data from a platform does not necessarily mean that it is the most relevant data for a phenomena. So the fact that a lot of the methods that have been developed on Twitter is because it's very easy to access Twitter data. However, as Julian is saying, a lot of the activity now happens in Telegram and slightly more obscure different channels. So it's also a balance between how suitable are the methods and how suitable are our findings if we are more data-driven rather than problem-driven or theory-driven. But yeah, good question. Thanks, Julian.
So I don't know if you have any other remarks, Matti, or if Maura wants to come in into the conversation and maybe pose some questions or reach some conclusions. Oh, there's the link to Twitter's open API. Hi, Maura.
Thanks, Matti. Thanks, Eugenia. I just actually posted the link to the Twitter API and the new. I guess that they're making a lot more of their data available for free to researchers, which is I think positive in many ways. And an interesting aspect is that I see that highlighted on the top page there is in fact research out of Cardiff University on hate, online hate, that's using Twitter data. I want to thank you both very much. I wondered if you had anything that you hadn't yet had the opportunity to say, or anything that you wanted to do in terms of wrapping up, Matti.
So, well, maybe I'll repeat the thing that criticism is the highest or the most sincere form of flattery. So by no means, by providing a critical perspective, do I dismiss any of the methods or the mechanism being used, because I also use them myself, and I am very interested in exploring how they're being used for various purposes. So I think one of the things that, and depending on how we pursue it further, one of the takeaways from the blog posts is that there are certain questions or certain kind of checks or certain kind of tick the boxes that are very useful to raise when you are applying different types of methods. And so automatically, by the fact that they are there, you don't necessarily need to use them. There are other ways of approaching the problem. But at the same time, when you use these methods, it is good to be aware of some of the debates that are increasingly going around them. And obviously, these debates are going in, they are very prolific and going in lots of directions. And so that has been done with the motivation that ideally the methods can be then used in a more effective and potentially more let's say a sustainable manner. And so that's why when we did the blog post, I was trying to put a lot of pointers that, okay, here is if we use content analysis, here are some of the debates that are now going on at the moment. Here, if you use predictive analysis, here are some of the debates that are going on. And again, trying to highlight the fact that these situations are not always technological or questions of validity, but they raise broader social and political questions around them, and these have to be highlighted as well. So in a way, a lot of the blog posts, I wish I would have written a book on them, but they ended up being a kind of an entry pointer into a rhizomatic, a big field of different potentials and methods and things being used. So hopefully people will get something out of them, and then can do their own research and find other perspectives then. So I think that's the kind of my conclusion.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms just of a comment from my own end as an audience member and listening to the conversation, that you know, I feel like this is a good time to really put these ideas on paper and whatnot, also because we see just in the last few days there is a special issue of Terrorism and Political Violence that has just been published, that is about terrorism and ethics quite broadly. But when I was listening to you talk there, Matti, I was thinking that a lot of your critique and whatnot and the concerns stated by both yourself and Eugenia are broadly ethical issues, if you like. So while some of the papers in the special issue were about quite practical ethics issues, one of the things I think is missing is precisely the sort of practical ethics issues around the deployment of these tools and that kind of thing on one level in our specific space, so online extremism and terrorism research, but also leveling it up the more the broader ethics issues that the use of these approaches use also, that I think Eugenia was coming back to you quite a lot. So I guess my point is I think it's very positive that we are beginning to talk more about ethics in extremism and terrorism research. I think we're certainly not early in terms of the ethics conversation, but you know, better late than never. And plainly, there's a bunch of additional stuff that has yet been raised that needs to be addressed in our field. And I think some of the things that you raised, Matti, in this conversation are important ones, absolutely.
It's also about finding a vocabulary to describe. So oftentimes takes a lot of time to find a vocabulary through which you can describe. So we are dealing with both methods plus a certain field of research, and to find that kind of vocabulary takes a bit of time and takes a bit of working, and there might not be any simple way of coming up with it. So hopefully we can find a vocabulary to that helps us address issues in a more systematic way.
So one question or comment I suppose we have from Elizabeth Pol concerns the transparency in making decisions about what data to look at, and she's referring basically to the Twitter tendencies. So basically, if you focus on one tweet, you get like one set of like findings. If you focus on retweets or the context in which the tweet was posted, you get different kind of like findings. So Liz makes the point that you have to be transparent in terms of the methodological decisions you make. Also, she says, we have had real problems in getting to the bottom of what search criteria Twitter use when searching and selling data. It's very ambiguous, but less so now that it is available on the API. Big data research is not always as easy as people think, but these issues are often hidden in the findings people present. That's absolutely the case, yeah. And I feel like, I feel guilty here because that's what we've done in the past, but I suppose like people then read your article and then they constructively engage with it, hopefully, and critically engage with it. I also wanted to bring to the discussion an area that we didn't touch at all, but I think it's quite important that concerns the safety of like the researchers who are doing this kind of research. And on the one hand, I suppose when it comes to extremism, you're much safer if you are behind a screen looking at some really unpleasant people. But on the other hand, in terms of your mental health and your kind of lack of exposure to this kind of toxicity is something that has to be taken into account. So I suppose the ethics is not only the ethics of the research, but the ethics of protecting researchers themselves as well.
And maybe just quickly responding to Elizabeth was saying, I completely understand, and I'm also guilty. So I think it comes incrementally with skill, because these systems are very hard to use. And there is something to be made for the reproducibility of research, which is one of the standards that computer science often at its best operates, not in practice always, but at its best operates, so that we know exactly through what kind of data the results have been derived through what kind of algorithms. But the challenge there is that then takes a lot of training of researchers who don't have the technical background. So how we work. So I think one of the things that I think what VOX Pol has been doing and what we have been also part of the workshop is trying to have a debate or dialogue between computer scientists and social scientists, because we have, as an anthropologist, I have a lot of blind spots. And how to use Twitter API, it is close to ritual magic in a kind of more anthropological sense. But the more you do it, the more you learn the different things. So obviously transparency of what type of data, how it's being collected, and the challenges of that should be the first step for research, because you're not hiding anything, ideally. It's just, yeah. But yeah, ethics, I agree. I do agree. It is even a more pressing challenge in the more kind of ethnographic research, because you are not as separated. So there has been interesting articles about researching people who you fundamentally disagree with, and all the kind of content moderation, mental health issues. It's a big thing. But yeah, no, I do agree on that. So again, I think, yeah, it is something that we all can remind ourselves and learn that let's try to be more transparent and more forthcoming about everything that we're doing.
That's maybe a good sentiment to end on, to be more transparent and more forthcoming about what we're doing, and also researcher welfare issues. I want to thank Matti for all his insights, Eugenia for coming up with some great questions. I want to thank everybody who stuck with us past 5 p.m. We're going to put the video up on our YouTube channel. We'll tweet about that when it's available. And you can follow VOX Pol on Twitter, and we hope to see some of you at future events. But for now, have a great evening, and thanks again.
Thanks, Maura.